The first time they banned me from fishing on the lake, I thought it was just another HOA power trip. The second time, when they tried to tell me I couldn't even cruise my boat, I realized they had no clue who they were messing with. Fast forward a few months, I own the whole lake, the land around it, and their neighborhood is now banned from stepping one toe in the water. And believe me, that's when things really got fun. I bought the place for the lake, plain and simple. Sure, the cabin was charming, and the little stretch of land it sat on was nice enough, but none of that mattered compared to the wide, sparkling lake out back. From the first day I moved in, that water became my sanctuary. Early mornings, late evenings, lazy Saturdays, it didn't matter. If the sun was up, you could probably find me out there, casting a line or just cruising the glassy surface with a cup of coffee in hand. Fishing was how I cleared my head, how I kept myself steady. I never thought twice about it either. The lake wasn't some private country club affair. It sat on the border between my property and the Willow Shores HOA community. Half their homes didn't even touch the water, and the half that did had little aluminum docks jutting out like sad toothpicks. My side of the lake had been unincorporated land for decades. Nobody bothered me. Nobody cared. At least, not until the wrong kind of people moved in across the water. It started subtle, like these things always do. A few disapproving glances when I motored across the lake in the mornings. A couple of wagging fingers from neatly pressed women in visors and matching tracksuits. I ignored it. Figured maybe they didn't like my boat's old two-stroke engine humming through their precious serenity. Too bad. Then one Saturday afternoon, after pulling in a beautiful 6-pound bass, I found a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a violation notice, or, at least, it tried to look like one. Unauthorized use of community lake. It read in big, bold letters. Fishing permits required for community members. I laughed out loud standing there in the gravel lot. First off, there was no such thing as a community fishing permit, not for a public water body like this one. Second, I wasn't a community member in their HOA. I owned my land independently. Third, even if the lake was private, which it wasn't, my property line went right into the water. They had no authority over me. I crumpled the notice, tossed it into the bed of my truck, and went home to clean my catch. I figured that was the end of it. Maybe some bored volunteer on the HOA board had gotten a little too into their clipboard for the weekend. No big deal. But the next time I launched my boat, things escalated. About halfway across the lake, right where the sun was glinting off the water, and a school of minnows flickered just below the surface, I heard it, a loud, tinny voice blaring through a bullhorn. Boat operator, return to shore immediately. Unauthorized access to Willow Shores property is prohibited. I shielded my eyes from the sun and spotted them, 3 people standing on one of the HOA docks, waving frantically like airport traffic controllers. One had the bullhorn, another was filming with a phone. The third, an older woman with a visor so stiff it could have been used as a weapon, was pointing at a laminated sign nailed hastily to a wooden post. Private community lake. Members only. Trespassers will be prosecuted. I killed the motor and just drifted for a moment, stunned. I wasn't even near their shoreline. I was smack dab in the middle of the water, well within my own rights. I called back calmly. I'm fishing from my own property line. You have no authority over this lake. The woman with the bullhorn just repeated her demand, louder and more shrill this time. I could feel my blood pressure rising but forced myself to smile and wave. I restarted the motor, cruised lazily back to my dock, and went inside. That night, curiosity gnawed at me. I dug out my property records, the county lake surveys, even old zoning maps I had stuffed in a filing cabinet from when I bought the place. It was all there, plain as day. The lake wasn't listed as private. It had no governing body. It wasn't even fully inside Willow Shores jurisdiction. Half the shoreline was public easement. Half was private landowners like me. The HOA could no more ban me from the water than they could outlaw birds flying over their houses. Armed with proof, I marched over to their next HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse by the pool. Walking in was like stepping into a hornet's nest. Dozens of people turned to glare at me the second I crossed the threshold. I didn't even get to sit down before a woman named Beverly, HOA president, as she wasted no time announcing, stomped over in her orthopedic sandals. "You're not authorized to be here," she barked. I held up my folder. "Just here to clarify something. You've been issuing violation notices about the lake. Here's the problem. You don't own it. You don't govern it. And you sure as hell don't have any fishing permit authority." I laid the documents out on a folding table, tapping them for emphasis. The county maps, the property lines, the zoning records. It was ironclad, indisputable. Beverly didn't even look. She just folded her arms and gave me a tight, joyless smile. "The board has decided the lake is a protected community asset," she said, as if that settled it. I blinked. "Decided? You can't just decide that." Around us, heads were nodding grimly, people muttering under their breath about outsiders and safety concerns. One man, red-faced and sweating through his golf shirt, jabbed a finger toward me. "You don't belong here. You're not one of us." A few others cheered. It was like watching a witch trial unfold in slow motion. Beverly cleared her throat dramatically. "Effective immediately, non-community members are prohibited from using the lake in any capacity, fishing, boating, swimming, or otherwise. Violators will be subject to fines, trespassing charges, and potential legal action." She pulled out a pre-printed document and slapped it on the table. "Consider yourself officially notified." I stared at the paper. It was laughable. No legal weight, no signatures from the county, no mention of property law, just an HOA flexing muscles it didn't have. Still, standing there in that clubhouse, surrounded by pitchfork energy disguised as suburban civility, something shifted in me. I realized that reasoning wasn't going to work. Facts didn't matter to these people. Their reality was whatever they wanted it to be. I gathered my papers, tucked them under my arm, and left without another word. As I crossed the parking lot to my truck, I heard someone shout behind me, "Better find a new hobby, buddy." Laughter followed. Tires crunching over the gravel, I drove home with a knot in my stomach and a fire beginning to build in my chest. The kind of fire that only needed a little more fuel to turn into something unstoppable. The kind of fire that whispered, "By the damn lake," but that moment hadn't come yet. No, first they had to push me just a little bit further. And judging by the way they acted that night, it wouldn't take them long. I spent the next few days stewing in my own frustration, pacing the dock, tossing pebbles into the water, and listening to the quiet lapping of waves against the shoreline that suddenly, somehow, didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. I wasn't angry about the fishing. Not really. I was angry about the principle of it. The audacity of a bunch of self-important clipboard warriors thinking they could draw a line through a body of water and tell me where I could exist. I wasn't some weekend guest. I wasn't a trespasser. I lived here. I belonged to this lake in a way they never could. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that stomping your feet and shouting doesn't fix anything. No, you have to think colder than that. Smarter. You have to make yourself the force they can't argue with. And sitting there on my dock one evening, watching the last of the sun melt into the tree line, a thought settled into my brain with the weight of inevitability. If they thought they owned the lake, maybe it was time to show them what ownership really looked like. The next morning, I took a thermos of coffee and drove to the county recorder's office. The building itself was a squat, crumbling thing tucked between a payday loan shop and a shuttered dry cleaner. But the records inside were pure gold if you knew how to read them. I spent hours hunched over yellowed maps, zoning plats, tax assessments, and land grant filings. The girl behind the counter gave me a wide berth after the first 2 hours, probably assuming I was either a lunatic or a developer. She wasn't wrong on either count. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. It turned out that the lake, which everyone just assumed was community property, was technically designated as unincorporated natural land. It had been owned at various points by different parties: a farmer in the 1940s, a failed resort company in the 70s, an investment trust sometime in the late 90s. But somewhere along the line, When that trust dissolved during the last recession, the lake and its immediate surroundings had fallen into a kind of legal limbo. More importantly, part of the shoreline, including the land that fed the only 2 boat ramps accessible to the HOA neighborhood, had recently been slapped with delinquent tax liens. Properties nobody wanted because they were swampy, overgrown, and a nightmare to develop. To me, though, they looked like opportunity wrapped in wild grass and brambles. I called up an old friend of mine, Marcus, who worked real estate for a big title company downtown. After explaining the situation in vague terms, very vague, he agreed to meet me for lunch and poke around discreetly. "You didn't hear it from me," he said, sliding a manila folder across the greasy diner table. "But there's a bank that's been trying to offload these parcels for pennies just to clear their books. No one's buying. Liability issues. Access problems. They'd probably kiss your boots if you showed up with cash." I asked him what he thought it would take to secure it all. The lake, the shoreline, the ramps, every inch I could get my hands on. He gave a low whistle and a number that made my stomach tighten. But then he grinned. "It's doable, if you move fast." I went home, poured myself a whiskey, and stared at my savings account for a long, hard hour. I had been squirreling away money for years for a different dream. Maybe a second property, maybe a trip around the world. But suddenly, none of that seemed important anymore. Protecting my home, my dignity, my peace, that was worth more than any adventure. I made the call the next morning. No loans, no delays, full cash offer, sight unseen. I wanted every parcel that touched the lake, plus a buffer zone of land around it. I wanted the boat ramps. I wanted the footpaths. I wanted the neglected drainage easement nobody cared about. I wanted it all, and I wanted it airtight. It took 3 nerve-wracking weeks of paperwork, bank transfers, quiet negotiations, and very expensive legal consultations. But by the end of it, the deed was mine, officially recorded. Stamped, sealed, irrevocable. The first thing I did was install signs, big ones, aluminum, double-bolted into the earth every 20 feet along the shoreline. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I put heavy chains and padlocks on the 2 boat ramps that service the Willow Shores neighborhood. I hired a local handyman crew to erect a simple, sturdy fence along the property lines that directly abutted their walking trails. Nothing fancy. Just enough to make it crystal clear where public fantasy ended and private ownership began. I even registered the lake itself with the county under a newly formed LLC, Lakefront Holdings, which sounded just official enough to make people think twice before trying to bully me. By the time I was finished, every legal barrier had been erected. It wasn't just, "You can't fish here anymore." It was, "Step 1 foot on this land or water, and you're risking a lawsuit you can't afford." The first day the HOA realized what happened was one of the finest mornings of my life. I had gotten up early, rigged a line, and puttered out onto the lake in my old aluminum boat, whistling a tune and feeling lighter than I had in months. I dropped anchor smack dab in the middle, popped open a thermos of coffee, and cast my line lazily into the mist. Around 9 a.m., I heard the commotion start. At first it was just a few angry shouts from across the water. Then came the honking horns, as frustrated residents discovered the chained-off boat ramps. Then the emails started, furious blasts of all-caps rage that somehow managed to combine legal threats, moral indignation, and thinly veiled insults into single, barely coherent paragraphs. They accused me of everything from eco-terrorism to theft of public assets. One woman even demanded I be arrested for emotional damages to the community. I laughed so hard reading that one I nearly dropped my phone into the lake. Later that evening, the HOA scrambled to call an emergency meeting at their clubhouse. The parking lot overflowed with SUVs and golf carts. From my porch, I could see them pacing, gesturing wildly, some even shouting. A few broke off and walked down to the newly fenced trail entrance, staring in disbelief at the no trespassing signs glaring back at them. Someone rattled the padlock on one of the ramps so hard I thought they might tear the whole gate down, but they didn't, because deep down, even in their rage and denial, they knew the truth. They had pushed and pushed and pushed and now they were locked out of the very thing they thought they controlled. The days that followed were a symphony of delicious irony. Every morning, I'd take my boat out, drifting lazily across the water, sometimes fishing, sometimes just letting the sun soak into my bones while the furious glares from the shore bounced harmlessly off my sunglasses. Sometimes they'd gather in little clusters at the edge of their property, clutching their Starbucks cups and peering through binoculars like a bunch of retired spies. Sometimes they'd send grim-faced security patrols to stand impotently at the fences, scribbling notes on clipboards like they were documenting war crimes. I waved every time. Big, friendly waves. Sometimes I even tipped my hat. They never waved back. The best moment came a week later when Beverly herself, HOA Queen Bee, monarch of misplaced authority, marched down to the fence line, bullhorn in hand, and tried to shout me down from across the water. "You are violating community agreements," she screeched, voice crackling through the cheap speaker. "You will be fined daily until excess is restored." I cast my line lazily, reeled it in, and shouted back, "You can fine me all you want, Beverly, but unless you can find the LLC that owns this lake, you're shouting at the wind." The look on her face when she realized what that meant was something I'll carry with me to my grave. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Personally, I think it's best served with a fishing pole in hand, a cold beer in the cooler, and the serene satisfaction of knowing you didn't just win, you made it so they couldn't even see the battlefield anymore. At first, I thought the new signs and fences would be enough. Surely, I figured, even the most stubborn HOA warriors would understand what private property meant when it was printed in bold letters and reinforced with chains, padlocks, and enough legal authority to make even the greediest developer sweat. For a few days, it even seemed like I was right. The lake was blissfully quiet. No kids tossing frisbees into the water from the HOA trails. No off-leash dogs barreling into my yard. No paddleboards drifting across my sightline with Bluetooth speakers blaring pop music. Just me, the fish, and the sunlight dancing across the ripples. Peace had returned. But peace, it turned out, was just the silence before the storm. It started small, footprints down by the southern edge of the lake, where the tree line thinned out, a candy wrapper wedged under my dock, a kayak bobbing suspiciously close to my side of the waterline. At first, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was a lost kid. Maybe someone didn't realize the rules had changed. I didn't want to be the cranky old man yelling at clouds. So, when I spotted the first real trespasser, a teenager dragging a fishing pole and a cooler onto my side of the shore, I kept it polite. Walked down, smiled, and said, "Hey there, this is now private property. I'm going to have to ask you to head back the way you came." The kid turned beet red, mumbled an apology, and scampered off. Easy. Done. Maybe this wouldn't turn into a problem after all. But then, it kept happening. A woman in expensive yoga gear jogging with her golden retriever, pretending not to see the no trespassing signs as she splashed along the shallows. Two men unloading a canoe right at the foot of one of the chained-off ramps, ignoring the padlocks like they were decorative. A group of kids throwing a football across the lake, their shouts echoing through the valley while their parents watched from the HOA trail, sipping lattes and pretending they didn't see. Every time, I stayed calm, walked down, politely explained, politely asked them to leave, politely pointed at the signs and the fences and the deeds I had hanging laminated on the community bulletin board. And every time, the reactions got a little colder, a little more defiant. The HOA board stopped responding to my emails altogether. I sent them pictures of trespassers. I cited local trespassing laws. I offered to set up a permitting system if they wanted to negotiate lake access the right way. No response. Only more footprints, more litter, more blatant intrusions. It became obvious that this wasn't about confusion. It was about defiance. They didn't like losing, and if they couldn't win the lake back fair and square, they were going to pretend the rules didn't apply. They were used to getting their way through stubbornness and bullying, and old habits die hard. Still, I held my ground. I called the sheriff's office when it got bad, but half the time, by the time deputies showed up, the trespassers had scurried away. Warnings were issued, but citations were rare. The deputies, to their credit, seemed sympathetic. But they also made it clear that unless I wanted to press full criminal charges against my own neighbors, something I wasn't quite ready to do yet, there wasn't much they could do beyond the occasional patrol. I could have let it slide, could have stayed quiet and stewed. But that's not how I'm wired. You see, while they were playing checkers, I was playing chess. I didn't buy that lake just to fish in peace. I bought it to make a point, and when they decided to push back against the lawful boundaries I put in place, they gave me the green light to push back harder. The official lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a smug courier who looked like he enjoyed the idea of handing me bad news. Civil complaint, community property dispute, the cover sheet read. Filed by the Willow Shores Homeowners Association. In it, they alleged that the lake was, and always had been, an essential and inseparable amenity of their community. That the previous landowners had implicitly allowed open and notorious use of the lake, creating a prescriptive easement that should nullify any claim of private ownership. In short, they were arguing that because they had gotten used to treating the lake like theirs, it should be theirs. It was legal fantasy, wishful thinking wrapped in legalese. But it was real enough to drag me into court. I sat down at my kitchen table, read through the entire packet, and smiled. They had no idea what they were walking into. You see, while they had been busy gossiping and writing angry emails, I had been assembling an arsenal. Original deeds going back to the 1940s, survey maps certified by licensed engineers, tax payment records showing uninterrupted ownership, a paper trail so clean and airtight you could have used it as a submarine hull. I had hired one of the best property attorneys in the state, a pit bull of a woman named Clarissa Mayfield, who could turn a boundary dispute into a courtroom bloodbath without raising her voice. Clarissa and I spent the next few weeks building the case brick by meticulous brick. Every prescriptive easement claim they tried to raise, smashed by records showing that prior owners had posted no trespassing signs intermittently for decades, long before I ever bought the place. Every community asset argument they floated, destroyed by zoning maps showing the lake was always separately parceled and never once listed in the Willow Shores development plans. By the time we were done, the evidence binder was so thick it needed its own rolling suitcase. The depositions were the first sign that things were falling apart for them. Watching the HOA board members under oath was like watching wet tissue paper trying to hold back a flood. Beverly, the queen bee herself, melted down halfway through her testimony, insisting loudly that everyone knows the lake belonged to the community, despite admitting minutes earlier that she had never seen a single deed or legal document proving that fact. Her vice president, some weasel-faced guy named Carl, contradicted her 5 minutes later by admitting he knew the lake wasn't technically part of their governing documents but thought it was close enough. Even their own hired surveyor looked uncomfortable when Clarissa grilled him about the sloppy, half-finished maps they had submitted as evidence. Word started to spread around town, first in whispers, then in newsprint. The local paper picked up the story, spinning it into a David versus worse Goliath fable with me as the embattled homeowner standing against the mighty, overreaching HOA. The comments section lit up like fireworks. Half the town hated HOAs already, and they reveled in every embarrassing detail that came out of the depositions. When Beverly accidentally admitted that part of her motivation for banning me originally was because she didn't like the look of his boat, it made the front page. When Carl accidentally left his mic on during a break and was overheard calling residents a bunch of idiots who can't even read a plat map, it made the evening news. Behind the scenes, the HOA board started cracking under the pressure. I heard whispers from sympathetic neighbors who still had friends on the inside. Beverly and Carl weren't speaking. Half the board wanted to settle and quietly drop the lawsuit before things got worse. The other half wanted to double down, convinced they could win if they just explained it better to the judge. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Emergency board elections were rumored. Some families started trying to distance themselves from the HOA entirely, claiming they never supported the lawsuit in the first place. It was beautiful chaos, unfolding exactly the way I had hoped. Meanwhile, I kept doing what I always did, fishing, smiling, waving politely when the few remaining diehards scowled at me across the fences. They thought they were fighting for control of a pond. What they didn't realize was that they had already lost something much more important: the respect of their neighbors, the trust of their community, and whatever flimsy credibility they had left. All I had to do now was let them finish digging their own graves. The day of the court ruling arrived with the kind of quiet, ominous stillness that usually precedes a tornado. I sat in the courtroom in my best boots and cleanest flannel, hands resting calmly on the polished oak table, while Beverly and her miserable entourage huddled together across the aisle like school children, waiting outside the principal's office. The judge, a gruff old man with a bushy mustache and a reputation for taking exactly zero nonsense, took his seat with a sigh, flipping through a thick sheaf of papers. He adjusted his glasses, looked out over the courtroom, and said in a voice dry enough to suck the humidity out of the air, "In the matter of Willow Shores Homeowners Association versus Lakefront Holdings, LLC, regarding property rights to the lake in question, I have reached a decision." You could have heard a pin drop. The HOA lawyer, a slick little man who looked like he moonlighted selling used cars, leaned forward eagerly. Clarissa sat stone-faced beside me, arms crossed, exuding the kind of relaxed confidence that only comes from knowing you are about to absolutely annihilate your opponent. The judge continued, reading from his notes in a slow, deliberate tone. After reviewing the submitted evidence, deeds, tax records, historical surveys, and applicable zoning regulations, it is the opinion of this court that the Willow Shores Homeowners Association has absolutely no legal claim to the lake, its shoreline, or any associated access points. Beverly let out a tiny, involuntary squeak, like someone had just stepped on a mouse. The judge barely paused. Furthermore, he said, lifting his eyes to glare directly at the HOA table, the plaintiff's arguments regarding prescriptive easement are without merit, unsupported by credible evidence, and, quite frankly, embarrassing to this court. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. It is not the role of this court to reward entitlement dressed up as tradition, nor is it the court's responsibility to protect plaintiffs from the consequences of their own arrogance. I thought Clarissa might actually crack a smile at that one, but she kept it together. The judge wasn't finished. Accordingly, he said, judgment is awarded to the defendant. All claims by the plaintiff are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the plaintiff shall be responsible for the defendant's legal fees and court costs in full. Beverly's lawyer turned the color of unpasteurized milk. Beverly herself just sat there, mouth hanging open, as the weight of the financial ruin she had dragged her entire HOA into sank in. The figure wasn't small. Between attorney fees, deposition costs, court fees, and document preparation, they owed me, or rather, Clarissa, well into the six figures. And the best part was, since the HOA had no real rainy day fund, those costs would be divided directly among the homeowners. Every smug busybody who had cheered on the ban, every nosy neighbor who waved their binoculars at me across the lake, every board member who sat silent while this train wreck barreled toward the cliff, they were all about to get a very personal invoice for their stupidity. I walked out of that courtroom into the sunshine feeling 20 pounds lighter. Beverly and her board scuttled out the side door like cockroaches fleeing the light, avoiding eye contact. Their bravado finally burned down to ash, but I was just getting started. See, winning the lawsuit wasn't enough. I wanted to make absolutely certain they never tried anything so foolish again. I called up Marcus and commissioned a set of new signs, massive ones, professionally made, the kind you usually see warning you about electrical substations or federal military testing grounds. Bold, clear, legally bulletproof. Private property, they screamed in letters as tall as a grown man. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. No lake access. No fishing. No boating. No exceptions. I installed them every 50 feet around the lake perimeter, backed by concrete footings and floodlights that lit them up like a sports stadium at night. Then I took it a step further. I hired a local security company, ex-cops mostly. Good guys who knew how to be professional without being aggressive, and paid them to do randomized patrols around the lake and my adjoining properties. They wore body cams, logged every incident, and didn't take any guff from the remaining stubborn trespassers who still thought the rules didn't apply to them. The first few weeks were a parade of red-faced HOA residents trying to argue their way past the patrols, only to be politely but firmly turned away, sometimes with local deputies backing up the authority of my new guards. I didn't press charges right away, though. No need. Just the humiliation of being escorted off the community's lake, like common criminals, was enough to start a slow, delicious rot inside Willow Shores. The collapse came faster than I expected. Word of the lawsuit loss spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, fanned by furious residents, realizing they were now on the hook for thousands of dollars each, thanks to the board's idiocy. Emergency meetings were called, accusations flew like arrows, and one by one, the board members fell like dominoes. Carl resigned first, blaming Beverly for reckless leadership. Then 2 more followed, citing health reasons and personal conflicts. Beverly herself clung to power for another week, stubbornly insisting she could rebuild trust. But when a group of furious homeowners showed up on her doorstep with a petition for a recall vote, she finally cracked and announced her resignation in a grim, tight-lipped Facebook post nobody bothered to like or comment on. It didn't end there. With the HOA's reputation in tatters, property values in Willow Shores started to dip. Realtors whispered the truth to prospective buyers. Messy lawsuits, community instability, financial liability for unresolved debts. Some houses sat empty for months. Prices slashed again and again. A few desperate homeowners even started advertising non-HOA adjacent access, as if proximity to the lake would somehow cancel out the neighborhood's tainted reputation. It didn't. Nothing could. The poison had seeped too deep. I'd see the for sale signs pop up and quietly, privately, smile to myself. They had built their little kingdom on sand, and now the tide had come in. Meanwhile, my side of the lake flourished. I fixed up the dock, restained the porch, even planted some wildflowers along the shoreline. I kept my fishing gear in pristine condition, made small repairs to my boat, and took more time than ever to enjoy what I had fought so hard to protect. But I wasn't quite finished delivering poetic justice. Not yet. I decided the best way to celebrate was with a party. Not just any party, a full-blown, unapologetic, lakeside extravaganza. I sent out invitations to everyone, except the Willow Shores HOA members. Friends from town, family from out of state, folks who had supported me quietly through the madness, they all got handwritten invites. Come fish, eat, and celebrate a lake reclaimed. The invitations read. The big day arrived, under clear blue skies. I set up a barbecue pit, right on the lakeshore, filled coolers with ice and beer, strung up lights between the trees, and arranged a row of loner fishing poles for anyone who wanted to try their luck. Clarissa came by, grinning like a cat in a creamery, and Marcus even brought his band to play some old country tunes into the evening. Kids splashed in the shallows. Adults lounged on deck chairs with plates piled high with ribs and cornbread. Every once in a while, I caught a glimpse of a few HOA residents lurking miserably behind their fences, peering out like exiled monarchs watching a coronation they weren't invited to. One of them, an especially sour-faced woman who had once written a furious, open letter about outsiders degrading community standards, stood there for a full hour clutching a bottle of wine she was apparently too proud to drink alone. I raised my beer in a silent toast to her from across the water. She turned and stormed back inside. As the sun dipped low, painting the lake in hues of gold and pink, I climbed into my old aluminum boat one last time that evening. I pushed off from the dock with a gentle shove, letting the current carry me out into the center of the water. The music from shore faded into a soft, happy murmur. I cast my line into the glowing ripples, leaned back against the worn seat, and watched the stars blink awake one by one. The air was cool, clean, and utterly mine. No shouts, no bullhorns. No clipboard warriors measuring my existence with a ruler. Just the steady rocking of the boat, the occasional plop of a fish surfacing, and the deep, satisfying knowledge that when they tried to take my lake, they didn't just lose the fight. They lost everything that mattered. The lake belonged to me now, and so did the peace that came with it.